For decades, the world believed global supply chains were unbreakable, that no matter what happened, store shelves would stay full, factories would keep running, and goods would always arrive on time. But then, one rule, just one trade principle that everyone trusted, quietly pushed the entire system to the edge. When it failed, ports froze, factories shut down, inflation exploded, and millions realized something terrifying. The global supply chain was never strong, it was just fast. And once speed became the only goal, collapse was inevitable. This rule wasn't written in law books or announced in dramatic speeches. It was adopted silently by corporations, governments, and global institutions. It was called efficiency, more specifically, just-in-time trade. The idea was simple and seductive. Don't store extra inventory. Don't waste money on warehouses. Don't prepare for rare disruptions. Instead, produce only what you need, exactly when you need it, and move it across borders at maximum speed. On paper, it looked perfect. Costs dropped, profits rose, shareholders were happy. And for a while, the system looked like a miracle. A car factory in Michigan could rely on a single microchip from Taiwan. A hospital in California could depend on medical gloves from Malaysia. A supermarket in Texas could restock shelves using food that crossed 5 countries before arriving. Everything was connected, synchronized, and optimized to the second. No backups, no buffers, no slack. The system worked beautifully, as long as nothing went wrong. But here's the uncomfortable truth most people never hear. Just-in-time trade doesn't remove risk. It hides it. It pushes fragility deep into the system, where no one can see it until it's too late. The moment one link breaks, the entire chain doesn't bend. It snaps. Before we go deeper, if you enjoy deep dives like this into hidden global failures, take a second to like this video and subscribe to Silent Collapse. It really helps the channel grow, and it lets us keep exposing the systems that quietly shape your life. The real danger of this trade rule was that it trained the world to believe efficiency was the same as resilience. Governments stopped asking where critical goods came from. Companies stopped caring how many borders a product crossed. As long as it was cheap and fast, it was considered safe. Warehouses were labeled waste. Stockpiles were called old thinking. Redundancy was mocked as inefficiency. Then reality arrived. It didn't start with a dramatic explosion. It started with small delays. A factory shutdown here, to re-shut down. A shipping backlog there. A port running slower than usual. But because just-in-time systems operate with razor-thin margins, even minor disruptions turned into cascading failures. One delayed shipment meant another factory couldn't complete its product. That factory's delay affected another supplier, and suddenly a single missing part could shut down an entire industry. The COVID pandemic didn't create the collapse, it exposed it. When borders closed and workers stayed home, the system had no shock absorbers. Hospitals ran out of protective equipment. Car manufacturers parked thousands of unfinished vehicles because they were missing one low-cost component. Grocery stores saw empty shelves, not because food didn't exist, but because the logistics system couldn't adapt fast enough. And here's the part that shocked economists. Demand hadn't disappeared. Money was still flowing. Consumers were still buying. But the trade rule that prioritized speed over stability had stripped the system of flexibility. The global economy wasn't broken, it was brittle. Shipping costs exploded. A container that once cost $2,000 suddenly cost $20,000. Ports turned into parking lots for ships waiting weeks to unload. Trucking shortages meant goods sat idle even after arriving. Inflation surged, not because people suddenly became greedy, but because the cost of moving everything had multiplied. Governments scrambled for answers, but most of them were unprepared. Decades of outsourcing had hollowed out domestic production. Essential goods were no longer made close to home. Countries discovered they couldn't produce basic items without foreign inputs. The trade rule had turned interdependence into dependency. This wasn't just an economic problem, it was a strategic one. Nations realized that supply chains could be weaponized. A single export restriction could cripple entire industries abroad. Trade disputes stopped being about tariffs and became about leverage. Who controls the chips? Who controls the shipping lanes? Who controls the raw materials? The scariest part is that nothing truly collapsed all at once. The system kept limping forward, but weaker each time. Companies responded by raising prices, not building resilience. Governments talked about reform, but change was slow and expensive. Rebuilding buffers meant lower short-term profits, and the market punished anyone who tried. Just-in-time trade had trained the world to chase quarterly earnings instead of long-term survival. And that mindset didn't disappear when the crisis hit. It doubled down. Even today, many supply chains remain one disruption away from chaos. Geopolitical tensions, climate disasters, labor strikes, cyber attacks, any one of these can trigger the same domino effect again. The rule hasn't been replaced, it's just been slightly adjusted, with the same risks hiding underneath. What makes this collapse truly silent is that most people never see the cause. They feel it as higher prices, delayed deliveries, or shortages, but they're told it's temporary, unavoidable, or someone else's fault. The deeper issue is rarely questioned. The single trade rule that prioritized efficiency over resilience, because questioning it means admitting something uncomfortable, that the global system was built on a fragile assumption, that the world would always remain stable, cooperative, and predictable. History tells us that assumption never lasts. As we move forward, some companies and countries are quietly changing course. They're reshoring production, building regional supply chains, holding more inventory, not because it's cheaper, but because survival is finally worth the cost. But this transition is slow, and the risks remain. So the next time you see empty shelves, rising prices, or headlines about supply chain disruptions, remember, this wasn't an accident, it wasn't bad luck, it was the result of a single rule. The world followed it without question, until it broke everything at once. If this made you see global trade differently, drop a comment. And tell me what part surprised you the most. Share this video with someone who still thinks supply chains just work, and stay tuned with Silent Collapse, because the systems that fail quietly are always the ones that shape our future the most. The story doesn't end where most explanations stop. In many ways, that was only the first warning shot. Because once the world experienced how fragile just-in-time trade really was, a new and more dangerous phase began. Companies didn't just lose goods, they lost trust. Trust in timing, trust in contracts, and trust that the next shipment would arrive at all. And when trust disappears from supply chains, behavior changes fast. Manufacturers started over-ordering out of fear. Retailers placed duplicate orders with multiple suppliers, hoping at least one shipment would arrive. This created artificial demand, which made shortages look even worse than they already were. Factories couldn't tell what demand was real anymore. Ports became clogged not only with delayed ships, but with goods no one could immediately sell. The system entered a feedback loop where panic itself became a disruption. At the same time, the just-in-time rule collided with another reality it was never designed for: geopolitics. Trade had been built on the assumption that politics would stay in the background. But once tensions rose between major powers, supply chains turned into pressure points. Export controls, sanctions, and trade restrictions exposed how dependent entire industries were on a handful of regions. One policy decision in one country could freeze production on the other side of the planet. Microchips became the clearest example. A tiny component, invisible to most consumers, suddenly determined the fate of cars, phones, appliances, and even military equipment. Years of just-in-time logic had concentrated chip production into a few locations. When disruption hit, there was no quick fix. You can't rebuild advanced manufacturing overnight. Efficiency had erased the margin for recovery. Climate change added another layer of stress. Floods shut down factories, droughts limited shipping routes, extreme weather disrupted harvesting and transport. Just-in-time systems, designed for predictability, struggled in a world that was becoming less predictable every year. Each event alone was manageable. Together, they created constant instability. What's dangerous is that the system still looks functional on the surface. Planes still fly, ships still move, stores still restock, but underneath, buffers remain thin. Dependencies remain concentrated, and resilience is still treated as a cost instead of an investment. The same rule is still guiding decisions, just with better PR language. Some companies now talk about just-in-case inventory, but many only apply it to headlines, not reality. True resilience is expensive. It means slower growth, lower margins, and uncomfortable conversations with investors. And in a market obsessed with speed, those trade-offs are still resisted. This is why the next disruption may feel even worse than the last. Not because the system hasn't learned anything, but because it learned just enough to survive, not enough to change. It adapted without healing. And systems that adapt without reform usually fail again, harder. The silent collapse isn't about one pandemic, one war, or one blocked shipping route. It's about a rule that taught the world to remove safety nets in exchange for short-term gains. A rule that worked perfectly in calm times and collapsed instantly under pressure. Until that rule is fully questioned, global supply chains will remain fast, impressive, and dangerously fragile. If you're still listening, you already understand something most people don't. This isn't just an economic story. It's a warning about how modern systems behave when efficiency replaces wisdom. Let me know in the comments if you think the world will truly move away from this model, or if we're headed for another shock. And don't forget to share this with someone who believes the next crisis will be different. On Silent Collapse, we don't wait for systems to fail loudly. We listen for the cracks while they're still quiet.